In 1985, the Soviet superpower covered 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It possessed 20,000 nuclear warheads, millions of men under arms, and an iron grip on Eastern Europe. 6 years later, it ceased to exist. It did not fall to a foreign invasion. No enemy tanks rolled across the red brick of Red Square. Instead, the most formidable empire of the modern era dissolved from within, undone by 5 fatal miscalculations made by the very men trying to save it. To understand how a superpower vanishes, you have to look past the grand speeches and look inside a quiet room in the Kremlin in the spring of 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev had just taken power. He was young, energetic, and acutely aware of a secret the rest of the world had not yet realized. The Soviet Union was broke. Decades of central planning meant factories were producing millions of shoes no one could wear, while basic foodstuffs vanished from store shelves. Thousands of miles away in western Siberia, oil fields that had funded the state budget were drying up, just as global oil prices began to plummet. Gorbachev believed the system was fundamentally good, but needed a repair. His first mistake was assuming that economic surgery could be performed without touching the political spine. He launched Perestroika, Restructuring. He allowed small private cooperatives, gave state enterprises more independence, and tried to introduce elements of a market economy into a system built to destroy markets. The result was immediate chaos. The old supply chains collapsed before new ones could take their place. Across 11 time zones, the rhythm of daily life ground to a halt. Citizens woke before dawn to stand in lines that stretched around city blocks, hoping to trade paper coupons for bread, soap, or a pair of boots. Factory managers hoarded raw materials, waiting for higher prices. Instead of fixing the economy, the partial reforms shattered what little functionality remained. Seeing the economic reform stall, Gorbachev made his second fatal gamble. He calculated that if he could not force the state bureaucracy to change from above, he would use the Soviet people to push it from below. He called it Glasnost, openness. For nearly 7 decades, the state had maintained absolute control over truth. Censorship was the glue holding hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and millions of citizens together. Glasnost pulled back the curtain. Suddenly, newspapers printed the horrifying body counts of Stalin's purges. State television broadcast reports on industrial pollution, rampant alcoholism, and the systemic corruption of senior party officials. Gorbachev believed transparency would create a patriotic surge of democratic enthusiasm. Instead, it triggered a wave of profound public disillusionment. Millions of citizens did not feel inspired, they felt betrayed. The state had lost its moral authority overnight. And once the fear was gone, the state lost its only remaining weapon of control. While the Kremlin wrestled with internal anger, a third disaster was quietly bleeding the regime white thousands of miles to the south. In December 1979, Soviet armor had rolled into Afghanistan, expecting a quick intervention to secure a friendly government. By the late 1980s, the war had morphed into an endless, agonizing drain on blood and treasure. Over 100,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped in a mountain war against determined insurgents funded by foreign rivals. In small Russian towns and Ukrainian villages, zinc coffins began arriving on train platforms in the middle of the night. Officers handed them to weeping mothers with strict orders not to open them. The military, once the supreme pride of the nation, was exposed as vulnerable and demoralized. Thousands of young men returned home wounded, addicted to heroin, or scarred by horrors the state media had denied for years. The war did not just drain billions of rubles from an empty treasury, it broke the military's myth of invincibility. As financial pressure mounted, Gorbachev looked outward. He made a fourth decision, one designed to ease tensions with the West and cut the staggering cost of maintaining an empire. For 40 years, the Soviet Union had maintained control over Eastern Europe through the explicit threat of military force. Tanks in East Berlin in 1953, Budapest in 1956, Prague in 1968. In 1989, Gorbachev privately signaled to the leaders of Poland, Hungary, and East Germany that the Red Army would no longer intervene to keep them in power. He believed that removing the threat of force would lead to reformed, friendly socialist allies. He severely underestimated how deeply the satellite states hated their regimes. Within months, the ripple turned into a tsunami. In Poland, trade unions took power. In Hungary, border guards clipped the barbed wire fences. By November, ordinary citizens were swinging sledgehammers at the Berlin Wall while Soviet soldiers stood in their watchtowers, holding their fire because no orders arrived from Moscow. The outer ring of the empire vanished in less than a year, without a single shot fired by the Red Army. The collapse of Eastern Europe sent a shockwave back into the Soviet heartland. If East Germany could break free, why couldn't the nations absorbed into the Soviet Union itself? This brought the empire to its fifth and final miscalculation, the belief that the Soviet borders were permanent. The Soviet Union was not a single country, but a federation of 15 distinct republics, spanning from the Baltic coast to Central Asia. For decades, the Kremlin had suppressed national identities. Under Glasnost, those identities reawakened with explosive force. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, human chains stretched across hundreds of miles as millions sang forbidden national anthems. In the Caucasus, ancient ethnic rivalries erupted into open conflict. In Moscow, political rivals saw an opportunity. Boris Yeltsin, an ousted party boss turned populist reformer, realized that if he built a power base around Russia itself, he could bypass the central Soviet government entirely. By 1991, the central government in Moscow ruled over a ghost state. It issued laws that nobody obeyed and printed money that nobody wanted. In a desperate, ill-fated attempt to stop the momentum, hardline communist officials held Gorbachev under house arrest at his summer villa in August 1991. They declared a state of emergency and sent tanks into the streets of Moscow to restore order. It was too late. The troops hesitated. Ordinary citizens stepped in front of the armored vehicles. Yeltsin climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, declaring the coup illegal. Within 3 days, the hardline rebellion collapsed in total humiliation. The August coup was meant to save the Union. Instead, it delivered the coup de grâce. It destroyed the last remnants of central authority. Over the next 4 months, republic after republic declared independence. On December 8, 1991, in a secluded hunting lodge near the Polish border, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus sat down with glasses of cognac and signed a brief document. It began with a single, devastating sentence: the USSR, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceases its existence. On Christmas night, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat before a television camera in the Kremlin, read his resignation speech, and set down his pen. Outside in the freezing Moscow air, the red hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the dome above Red Square for the final time. The Russian tricolor took its place. The Soviet collapse was not caused by a single cataclysmic defeat. It was the result of a system so rigid that any attempt to mend it destroyed it completely. In trying to reform an unreformable empire step by step, its leaders unleashed forces they could neither predict nor contain, proving that sometimes, the only thing more dangerous to a fragile state than total stagnation is sudden, uncontrolled change.